Hello and welcome to this evening's conversation, Catholic Teaching and Science. I'm Chris Fuller, the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer at St. Joseph's College of Maine. The sponsor of tonight's event is the St. Joseph's Center for Faith and Spirituality, and my guest for the conversation is Dr. Stephen Barr. Before his retirement, Dr. Barr was professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Delaware and author of a number of books, including A Student's Guide to Natural Science, Science and Religion, the Myth of Conflict, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, and The Believing Scientist, Essays on Science and Religion. In 1978, Dr. Barr received his PhD in physics from Princeton University, and he went on to do research at the University of Pennsylvania as a postdoctoral fellow from 1978 to 1980. Dr. Barr's research included cosmology and theoretical particle physics. In 2011, he was elected Fellow of the American Physical Society. As a practicing Catholic, Dr. Barr writes and discusses the relationship between faith and science. He was awarded the Benemerenti Medal by Pope Benedict XVI in 2007, and in 2010, he was elected a member of the Academy of Catholic Theology. He is also the founding president of the Society of Catholic Scientists. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Barr.
So I want to start with a general question, which is, you are a physicist. Mm-hmm. You have, I'm sure, have a busy research agenda with the university and teaching. What is it that, what was the impetus for moving in the direction of giving these talks and writing about the relationship between faith and science?
Well, I did have a busy schedule until 2 years ago when I retired.
Oh, okay.
But you're right. So what happened was, in 1995, I read a book that I thought was really, really interesting by a very famous mathematician who actually just won the Nobel Prize in Physics, interestingly enough, this year, named Roger Penrose. So I thought his book was extremely interesting, and I wrote a book review, and I sent it in to a magazine or a journal called First Thing, not expecting that they would publish it. And they did publish it, and then they started sending me other books to review that had to do with science and religion, and asked me to write articles on science and religion. So I did that for a while. And then in 2003, I thought, well, I've gotten a lot of experience writing now, and so I'm going to write my own book. And so I wrote a book called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. And then when that came out, I started getting invited to give talks all over the country. I've given probably over 150, maybe 200 by now, mostly on college campuses. So those YouTube videos, let me just hang up this phone. That's my son calling. Those YouTube videos are videos of various talks that I've given.
So let's start with the conversation about the relationship between religion and science, because as you are well aware, the go-to occasion to make the case, especially that the Catholic Church and science are at odds with one another, is Galileo.
Right?
So much so that in 1992, I used to show this to my students. The headline of the Los Angeles Times, October 31st, 1992, was "The Earth Revolves Around the Sun, Even for the Catholic Church." That was a headline that regarded Pope John Paul II's comments to the Pontifical Academy of Science after they had released their report about Galileo, what had happened during the Galileo affair. So let's start there. What can you tell us about our perceptions, people's perceptions about what happened versus what actually happened? As you point out in one of your talks, Galileo remained a faithful Catholic for the remainder of his life.
To all appearances, yes, he did. It's a very complicated story, so it would probably take hours to talk about the whole Galileo case. But the thing that I would say to people is that it was sort of an aberration. It was a very unfortunate and tragic confrontation between the church authorities and Galileo, but it wasn't typical of the church's involvement with science. And I used to ask audiences sometimes, and these would be college audiences or other audiences, what one name comes to mind when you think of the Catholic Church and science? And it would immediately, everyone would say in chorus, Galileo, which is very sad because the church has been interacting with science for 800 years. And with modern science, science as we know it today, for 400 years. And in that whole time, there's this one tragic episode. And it would be much, instead of relitigating that case and explaining all the complicated things that caused it to happen, it'd be better for people to know the whole story of the church's involvement with science. There's a professor at the university, at Johns Hopkins University, very highly respected, eminent historian of science. And he says in something he wrote that the historical evidence shows that the Catholic Church was probably the longest term, the greatest and largest and longest term patron of science in history. So the church has a very glorious record when it comes to science, but people hear about this one episode because, I guess they say in the newspaper business, if it bleeds, it leads. No, Galileo didn't bleed. They didn't execute him. They didn't torture him. He was put in house arrest in his villa in Tuscany. That was his punishment for lifelong house arrest. But anyway, people should know, in addition to the name of Galileo, they should know that there were several branches of science that were founded by scientists who were Catholic priests. So, for example, the science of geology was really the founder of it, you could say, was Blessed Nicholas Steno, who was a priest. The founder of genetics, everybody knows, was Gregor Mendel, who was a priest. And the founder of the Big Bang Theory was Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian priest and theoretical physicist. So there's just an amazing history that the church has of positively contributing, her members, and including bishops and priests, of contributing to science. But anyway, so Galileo, unfortunately, has become a big symbol, but it does show that occasionally church authorities screw up, but it doesn't show that the church is hostile to science.
In fact, his picture is on the webpage of the Pontifical Academy of Science.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and the typical thing with the newspapers, the church finally agrees that the earth goes around the sun. Well, actually, here's a very important point. In Galileo's time, the scientific community had not settled the question of whether the earth went around the sun or the sun went around the earth. There were scientists on both sides, and in fact, the scientific evidence was very mixed, very ambiguous. The scientific community didn't really achieve consensus that the earth goes around the sun until about 40 years after 40 or 50 years after Galileo was forced to recant. When Isaac Newton came along and discovered the laws of mechanics and gravity, and that really settled the question. So at the time of Galileo, it was not settled. And by the first actually observational evidence, direct observational evidence that the earth moves, didn't come until I think it was 1729. So that was about 100 years after Galileo. And it was not long after that the church removed the penalties, the restrictions on books that taught Copernicanism. So the church actually didn't take, the church already knew in the 1700s that it had made a mistake. And the idea that it didn't get around to admitting its mistake, it didn't say we made a mistake, but everybody knew, including everybody in the church by the 1700s. That
I think, in fact, I forget the exact date, but some point in the 1700s, the church even granted its imprimatur to the collected works of Galileo.
That was probably later. But I know in the I can't remember, in late 1700s, maybe 1760s, I can't remember. The restrictions on books that taught Copernicanism were lifted, and because it was already clear to everybody then.
Then part of your response to my question here, you mentioned kind of what we know of science today, and then kind of before that. And again, I think oftentimes people have this impression that what science is today, this what we call the scientific method, is what science is, and there wasn't science before that time. But in fact, there was science. It may not look like what science looks like today, but there were people doing scientific work, and those people were within the church, correct? Before the modern era.
So there was certainly science. There was science then in ancient times. The Greeks did remarkable things, the ancient Greeks. The Muslims did things in the, about between 800 and 1000. They did significant things. So there was science. And in the Middle Ages, there were very significant developments in science, which many people don't realize. So actually, the church contributed indirectly, but science as we know it today really took off with what's called the scientific revolution. And that's really happened in the 1600s. It was really the year 1600 and the century after that was when science really exploded. But the way was prepared for that. One historian of science has emphasized a lot that it was the founding of the university. In the Middle Ages, in the Catholic Middle Ages, the university was invented. And so you have to give the Catholic Church credit for inventing the university. And it was in the universities for the first time in history that science had a sort of solid institutional foundation. So that helped, in a way, prepare the way for the later scientific revolution indirectly.
Would it be, so I'm a theologian, and I'm interested in this topic of science as a theologian. Would it be accurate to describe also that from the kind of theological impetus, that is, the incarnation is a theology that tells us, God entered into our experience as part of creation. And therefore, the more we can know about that creation, which God has now become a part of, the closer we come to God. And that's a generative kind of idea from within theology. Is that a kind of correct?
Yeah, I know Stanley Yaki makes a big point of that. I'm not sure I'm not enough of a historian to know whether how much of a role that played, but certainly Christian ideas and religious ideas played a very big role. So first of all, of course, the ancient Greeks, some of them had had the idea of a natural world, and they were looking for natural explanations of things. But the idea that the world is a natural world gets support from Judaism and Christianity, because in ancient pagan religions, the world was filled with gods and goddesses and so forth, and the sun and the moon were gods, and lightning was caused by Zeus, and storms at sea were caused by Poseidon. And all. So the world was filled with divinity, with deities, and Judaism and Christianity, the biblical religions, said were strictly monotheistic and said, no, it stripped the world, the physical universe, of divinity. It said, no, God is not to be found in the world. He's not a part of the universe. He is the author he's creator of the universe and is radically distinct from the universe. And so that made the universe a natural world. It wasn't the abode of gods anymore, but the creation of the one God. So that was a very important thing. Also, the idea that the world was made by a rational, wise creator supported the idea that the universe was governed by rational principles, because it was made by the Logos, governed by God, the reason of God, or the divine Logos. And so that was very important also. In fact, the early Christian writers, or the church fathers, all the theologians and writers of the early church, laid very heavy stress on the idea that the universe testifies to its creator in two ways. One, by the fact that it exists at all, so you need some cause of existence. The other was by the fact that it was orderly. And you see this over and over in these early Christian writers, that the order of the universe points to God and its lawfulness. And this actually, the very notion that there are laws of nature has a Christian origin, because that notion that there are laws of nature developed in the 1600s appeared first clearly, at least in a clear way, in Descartes and Isaac Newton, who both based this idea on the fact that God was the lawgiver to the universe. The very notion of laws of nature comes from the idea that they are laws imposed on nature by God, a lawgiver. And so it's kind of ironic that in our day, well, and for a long time, atheists have said you don't need God because there are these laws of nature that explain everything, not realizing historically the very notion of laws of nature came from the idea that they were laws imposed on nature by the divine lawgiver. So,
and is it because of that then in your talks you distinguish between primary causes and secondary causes? And how does that help? How does that help us understand why it is, that there can be this relationship between, right, or at least the church and science?
That is a huge idea. I mean, if there's one thing that causes a lot of people to think that there's a conflict between science and faith, if there's one thing more than anything else, it's that they don't understand the distinction between primary and secondary cause. A lot of people, a lot of believers and a lot of atheists, they see God and nature as in competition with each other. God is a competing explanation. So that if something is created by God, that means it's supernatural. And if something has a natural explanation, then you're saying that God had nothing to do with it. This is deeply ingrained in a lot of people's thinking. But that's not the traditional Christian view or biblical view. The traditional view is that God is the author of nature. He's not a competition with nature. And the critical concept is primary and secondary cause. And the way I explain that is with an analogy, which is, if you've listened to one of my talks, or some of them, you might have heard this. So think of God's relation to the universe as analogous to an author's relationship to his novel. Okay? So consider a novel like The Hobbit. So in The Hobbit, you have a character named Barr the bowman, and he kills the dragon Smaug by shooting him with an arrow. And so if you ask, why did the dragon die? Did he die because Barr the bowman shot him with an arrow? Or did he die because Tolkien wrote the story that way? He wrote the book that way? Well, anybody hearing that would say, that's crazy. I mean, you don't have to choose both. The cause within the novel is the bowman shooting the dragon. That's the cause within the plot. But Tolkien, as the author of the novel, is the cause of the whole thing. Of everything that happens in the novel is caused by Tolkien, including the fact, first, that there's a novel at all, that there are characters, Smaug and Barr the bowman, that Barr the bowman shoots the dragon, and that causes the dragon to die. So, in fact, not only is Tolkien not competing, he's the cause of what would be you might say the primary cause, but the cause within the story you might consider the secondary causes, and they're not competing with each other. And the same thing with the universe. If you say with evolution, this becomes very clear with evolution. People think you have to choose between creation and evolution, but that's kind of crazy, actually, from a Catholic point of view. Because if you say, did this species, a hippopotamus or something, did that arise by a chain of causes within the plot of the universe, which is what evolution is describing? Or is that because the author of the universe, God, wrote the script that way? And the answer is both. There's no reason to choose between them. So I think that's a huge, people could understand that relationship between natural causes as being within so God, natural causes within the universe, but then God is the author of the universe, the cause of the whole universe, and everything that happens in it.
Yeah, so I think it's a good segue to talk about evolution, because when I was teaching, and I would often have students ask me, "Do you believe in evolution?" And I used to say, it's not necessarily something I believe in, it's whether or not it happens as far as the scientific method goes. But so there's the matter of the primary, secondary cause. Are there any other questions, comments people raise that are also, to your mind, that inhibit them or are impediments to them understanding that church teaching and evolution are not incompatible with each other?
Well, there's a number of things. There's a talk on YouTube where I talk about evolution. I'm a physicist. I'm not a biologist, so I apologize, whenever I talk about evolution. But a lot of the theological issues actually arise also when you're talking about physics. There are a lot of things. One, of course, some people think, well, it conflicts with Genesis. That actually was not a big issue. Well, it was for a while a bit of an issue for the Catholic Church, not because the church was committed to a very, very literalistic reading of Genesis, but because some of the early church fathers read Genesis in a literal way on some issues. And so you didn't want to depart from what the early church fathers, how they interpreted Genesis. But of course, they were living 2,000 years ago or almost two, and they had no reason not to read Genesis literally, Why wouldn't they? There was no competing explanation of things. So they tended to believe in 6 days and all this. But the church didn't actually. That's not been a big issue for the church. The big question for the church, Catholic Church, was not literal readings of Genesis. It had to do with human evolution. The church didn't really care very much, even in the early days of the theory of evolution. Didn't care that much about the evolution of plants and animals, or didn't care about natural selection and all that kind of thing. The only questions that were sensitive really for the church were human origins. Could you reconcile evolution with what we believe about, from a point of view of the Catholic faith, about human nature and human origins, original sin, and so forth? And there are some tricky questions there, but they're questions that have good answers. And so, but people should realize, first, one thing they don't realize, the church never condemned evolution. You'd be surprised at how many Catholics have the impression that the church traditionally condemned evolution and only recently came around to tolerating the idea. It's not true. The church never condemned it. Probably in part because it learned its lesson from the Galileo case, not to rush to judgment on certain things when it comes to science, especially.
And I found as a theologian where there was often confusion was between what the role that science plays in observing nature, hypotheses, that contributes to the theory of evolution, versus what some scientists do with those scientific conclusions, which are effectively philosophical arguments, right? And you make this distinction also that there's a difference between talking about biological evolution and biological materialism, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's one thing. So, for example, some people will say, well, evolution proves that we're just an accident, because science talks about random mutations, or just say, but there's a lot of sort of reading into the theory of evolution, certain philosophical conclusions. You don't have to believe, if you believe in evolution and you believe in that Darwinian mechanism of natural selection, and the neo-Darwinian idea acting on random genetic mutations. You don't have to believe that. That doesn't mean that we're accidental or the universe is pointless and all those things. Those are all philosophical glosses on the theory. Those are people's philosophical interpretations. They're not part of the theory itself or evolutionary biology. Those are people's philosophical spin, if you will. The crucial thing for the Catholic Church, as I said, was human evolution. And the critical point that the church has always insisted on is that human beings have spiritual souls. And what's spiritual about us traditionally is that we have reason and we have free will. Those are our spiritual powers. And the spiritual soul, the church has always insisted, is not something that can be explained just by physics or chemistry or biology. The spiritual soul is something at a different level than just atoms moving around. And so as long as you stay with that, St. John Paul II called that the essential point. Evolution is basically just a theory of how you started out with a lot of atoms. And eventually, over long periods of time, some of those atoms got arranged into us, into complex living things, including us, our bodies, our brains. But as long as you keep in mind that we're not just a collection of atoms, that we have spiritual souls, it doesn't really matter theologically exactly how those atoms got to be arranged this way. That's just for the biologists and the physicists to worry about. That's the crucial thing, is and once we grasp what St. John Paul II called the essential point, a lot of the problems go away.
Okay, thank you. So I'll open it up now to questions. Are there any possible scientific discoveries or theories that would refute some significant Catholic teaching?
That's an interesting question. Well, one that I could think of, but I don't see actually how one could ever scientifically establish such a thing, is if you were able somehow to prove that the universe was infinitely old. By the way, this is not the same as the question. This has not anything really to do with whether the universe is created. But we happen to believe that not only is the universe created, but we also happen to believe that it had a beginning, as the first verse of the Bible says, in the beginning. So that is traditionally understood to be a Catholic teaching, that the universe has a finite age. One could imagine that there are scientific theories out there, more scenarios where the universe is infinitely old. If you could somehow prove that one of those scenarios was correct, that might be a problem. But frankly, I can't imagine any realistic way that you could ever establish such a thing. So that's sort of more hypothetical. It's hard for me to actually think off the top of my head of an example now. If you could, I can think of certain things that would be problematic, but I actually can't imagine how those things could ever be established, or how you would ever, and I don't think they're true, but
so the same person added, and again, this may be outside of your field, so it said, could areas such as embryology or neuroscience cause the church to revise its doctrines on personhood or ensoulment?
I don't think about embryology. Now, there is an argument against free will that comes from neuroscience. And it's based on an experiment that was done in the 1980s by a guy named Benjamin Libet, Libet. I think that's how you pronounce his name, Benjamin Libet. And so there's been a lot of stuff written by scientists and philosophers about the Libet experiment. And some people argue that the Libet experiment showed we had no free will. It was a neuroscience experiment. So what they did is they hooked people up and they studied their brains, and they said to people, at a time of your choosing, I may get the details wrong, at a time of your choosing, in the next 5 minutes, move your hand. Okay? Meanwhile, they're watching for something. So what they discuss, and they also tell the person there's a clock where the hand goes around once a second. And they said, when you are consciously aware of having made the decision to move your hand, not only move your hand, but when you're consciously aware of having made the decision, look and see what the clock says. And what they found out is that about a half a second before the person became aware of having made the decision, consciously aware, something that's called the readiness potential was already building up in the brain. And some people interpret this to mean that the brain had already, a half a second before, made the decision, and the person was not consciously aware of it until a half second later, and they argue that shows that the decision was not free. It was made unconsciously before you're even aware of it, so it's not free. Well, there's a lot of philosophical objections to that argument, but it actually seems to not matter. I mean, so it's actually a weak argument against free will, but even if you, the thing that's interesting is that a few years ago, a neuroscience group did some experiments and some theoretical work that seems to blow that argument out of the water, because their work seems to show that the brain, the readiness potential that's building, this is an electrical potential building up in the brain, is not the brain having already made the decision. It's difficult to explain in a few words, but it's essentially more the brain is sort of thinking about it. Okay, it's wrestling with the question of whether it should make a decision. And so, but there's a case where there was a claim that a neuroscience experiment showed we didn't have free will. And if somehow neuroscience could show we didn't have free will, that would be huge. Okay, that would definitely be a problem for Catholic faith. But that particular experiment showed no such thing, as it turns out, and I doubt very much that any neuroscience experiment ever will show such a thing.
Some new question. A couple questions just came in here. Someone writes, when dealing with the new atheists and the belief only in science, or scientism as it's called, right, or biological materialism, how do you think the church should respond, especially with young people and their attraction to scientism, particularly if they're practicing Catholics?
Well, they first should respond early. So I think these are subjects that definitely have to be dealt with in high school, probably in junior high school or middle school, maybe earlier. Too little has been done about this. And so what happens when people get to high school, to college, it may be too late. There's a lot. The good news is that there's a lot of good stuff out there now, a lot of good material, and there are a lot of groups that are beginning to work on this. And there's actually a very good textbook. I actually have it. I didn't think I would be mentioning it, but there's the first ever book on science and from a Catholic point of view. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Faith, Science, and Reason. And it's a high school, but could also be used in college, actually, but it's a high school textbook on science and religion from a Catholic point of view. And it's written by a good friend of mine named Chris Baglow. It's, I believe, the first book ever written as a high school textbook on science and religion. And it covers just about everything you could think of very well. It's an excellent book. So there's stuff out there. I would also suggest that people go to the website of the Society of Catholic Scientists, because we've started to put some good stuff up of an educational sort there. So you can just Google Catholic Scientists and you'll find us, but it's Catholic Scientists, plural.org. So we have 16 common questions, we call them, about science and faith, with good, meaty answers that are around 700 or 800 words, with further reading, suggestions for further reading, and so forth. So they're the common questions we have up there with good answers. And we also have biographies, readable, short, illuminating biographies of 89 important Catholic scientists of the past. And it's really an impressive list of scientists, most of them very big names in the history of science, who were practicing, believing Catholics. And I recommend this. There are a lot of lists up there on the internet of Catholic scientists, but first of all, they're very unreliable, many of them. This is sort of a carefully curated list. Every scientist there was really a practicing, believing Catholic. And we also have in their bios, which explain why they were important scientifically and give some little something about their faith. So that, I think, would be a very powerful tool for high school, or, well, maybe high school students to use. And we
thank you. I posted the link in the chat here for people. If they want to find it, they can copy it and put themselves, or click on it. It'll take you to the webpage.
So there's lots of good stuff, and there are books out. Well, I've written some books, but there's other books as well. And so the good news, we're living in a time when, I would say 20, 30 years ago, it was actually hard to find good material. But now we have quite a bit of good material out there. So it's just people have to start using it.
So we have another question here. Someone writes, how is the doctrine of original sin affected by the theory of human evolution? Specifically, the Catechism insists that we have two literal first parents who committed a specific sin, whereas science seems to place the origin of humanity 100 to 200,000 years ago, and never smaller than a population of first humans.
That's an excellent question. In fact, when I talked about human origins, I was thinking primarily of that. So first of all, let's go back. So let's go back to the point that St. John Paul II called the essential point. And this, back in 1950, the first statement the Catholic Church ever made about evolution was in 1950. It was Pope Pius XII in an encyclical called Humani Generis. And his main point was that the spiritual soul is not just the product of evolution. And by the way, this is not a knock on evolution. Don't forget about evolution. Think about human reproduction. The church has always taught that the spiritual soul of the child is not just gotten from the parents. It doesn't arise through the chemistry and biology of the sperm and the egg uniting and so forth and so on. Every individual human being has his or her spiritual soul directly from God, as it were. Okay. It's not just produced by the chemistry and the biology of reproduction or of evolution. And once you realize that, so what do we mean? Let's ask, how did the human species originate? In evolutionary biology, a species, generally speaking, does not start there's not a first generation. A species doesn't appear suddenly in one generation. And so, for example, it doesn't make sense to say, what was the first cat? Was there a first cat whose parents were not cats and whose descendants were all cats? Was there a first horse? Was there a first whatever? No, because these things happen gradually over many generations by slow changes. There was not a sharp appearance of a new species like that. And so that seems to conflict with the idea that there were first human beings, Adam and Eve. But not if you recognize that from the church's point of view, a human being is not just a biological species defined by certain genetic characteristics or certain physiological characteristics. Our genetic and physiological characteristics presumably evolved very slowly over hundreds of thousands, millions of years. But the spiritual soul is something you either have it or you don't. You either have an immortal spiritual soul or you don't have one. You can't have 70% of one or 30% of one. And so there has to be, that development had to be sudden, logically. There had to be first beings in our lineage. There had to be first beings who had a spiritual soul. At a certain point, this is how theologians think about it now. There was an evolutionary process, but at a certain point, when evolution had proceeded to a certain point in our lineage where we were ready to, as it were, receive the gift, God raised some of these hominids to the level of rationality and freedom. He gave them the gift of rationality and freedom, or in other words, a spiritual soul. And that was a sudden thing. Now, how many did he do that for? Was it just one pair? By the way, and the question is right. There was, whenever Adam and Eve, or our first humans, lived, the first humans from a theological standpoint, that is, ones who had a spiritual soul, there were in existence, genetics says, thousands of interbreeding population of thousands. So God could have just raised two of them to the level of rationality and freedom, and that's Adam and Eve, or he might have raised many, or he might have raised the whole population. That is something the church has not definitively taught anything about. So, but the answer to the question in brief is that yes, at the physical level, physiological, it was gradual and involved a large population. But when you talk about the spirit, what St. John Paul II called the moment of transition to the spiritual, that was sudden. And we don't know how many that happened for. It could have been the whole population of thousands. It could have been a smaller population, subgroup of them.
Sure. So someone was building kind of off that previous question, and it was, can science, going to add to the question too, can science prove or disprove the existence of God?
I don't like the word proof. I don't like the word proof when it comes to the existence of God, and I don't like the word proof when it comes to science. Scientists don't usually talk about proving things. That's mathematics. In mathematics, you prove propositions rigorously. Natural science doesn't work that way. We don't prove something by some deductive argument. In science, in natural science, and this is what philosophers of science nowadays generally agree. It's not proof. It's what's called the inference to the best explanation. So you have some hypothesis, and if the hypothesis is the best explanation of all the data, then you believe it. The more it explains, and there are various things. If the hypothesis is simple and beautiful and coherent and it fits together with other things, and it has a lot of explanatory power, then you believe the hypothesis. It's not a proof. It's the same in a sense with God. I mean, I would say that God is the best explanation. That is, the hypothesis that there's a God who created the world explains a lot more than the alternative hypothesis. So in that sense, I think we have rational grounds for believing in God. One thing I would say is this. So as I said, the early there are many arguments for God, but the ones coming from the natural world are primarily two. And that the world exists, the cause of being, and that it's orderly. Science can't explain either of those things. First of all, science does not explain. I'm in physics. I'm in the field of physics called particle physics, and we're looking for the fundamental laws of physics. We're trying to find the most fundamental explanations of things in nature. We're not trying to prove, or we're not trying to explain why the world is orderly and lawful. We're trying to find out what that order is and what those laws are. Physicists aren't explaining why there are laws of physics. They're trying to find out what are the laws of physics. And so physics, to the question which many atheists don't ask themselves, why are there laws of physics at all? Why are there laws of nature? Descartes and Newton said because God, the lawgiver, imposed them on the world. There's no other explanation anyone's ever given, and certainly no explanation the science can give. Physics can't explain that. Physics assumes there are laws and looks for what they are. Same with the existence of the world. Even Hawking, when he was more lucid in 1988, made the point that all physics can give you is a set of rules and equations. That's what the laws of physics are. Physics about rules and equations that govern the universe. He said, but it can't explain, those rules and equations cannot explain why there's an actually existing universe for the rules to describe. See, so physics can't explain why there's a universe at all. And so those things I think God does explain, but science doesn't. So I wouldn't, it's not the job of science to explain why there's a universe at all, and it's not the job of science to explain why there are laws. So they're saying that science is going to prove God isn't the right way to think about it. The things that point to God are not, science is not going to end up concluding by looking through a telescope or a microscope or doing some calculation that there's a God. That's not what science is in the business of doing.
It seems to me that's a better way to talk about, to address this. I had some fellow Christian friends a few years ago asked me to watch a video. It was a video about intelligent design from a religious perspective. And I shared my concerns as a theologian with how it was presented, which the presentation was more, look at the human eye, it's so complex, how can you explain it? And my concern as a theologian was, well, science is trying to understand it. And if we say, well, where it can't be understood, that's where God is, once we understand it, we shrink God. We diminish God. And it seems to me what you're describing is a better way to be talking about how we think about God and relationship between that and what we think about, what we know about the universe.
Right. God, it's not my way. It's really the traditional way. Yeah. And as I said, this is the intelligent design, they're making a set of arguments that evolution can't explain there are certain things that can't be explained naturally about the natural world. And, it's conceivable. I mean, one can't rule out that there are things in the natural world, like the human eye or some other structure in biology that is so complex that it can't be given a natural explanation. You can't rule that out. But that's not the traditional way of arguing for God. God isn't a substitute for natural explanations. It's not, as I said, the traditional way of doing it. It's based, that way of looking at things is based, again, on the idea that it's God or nature, as if this is some kind of a football match between God and nature. So if nature explains something, score one for nature, and that's, and against God. And if God explains something, it's not a competition. And so people who have that mindset, they're looking for God in all the wrong places. They think that God exists where nature can't do something, and that's where you must look for him. Whereas the traditional view is nature itself testifies to God, because nature is God's handiwork. If you want to see evidence for God, look around you. Don't look to the laws of physics. Don't find something that doesn't obey the laws of physics. Look to the laws of physics. They themselves testify to the lawgiver.
And it seems to me that the confusion of that argument is what we talked about earlier, confusing primary and secondary causes in trying to make the argument itself. Right?
It's certainly true that we believe as Catholics that God sometimes causes things to happen that aren't the result of natural causes.
Absolutely.
And so a miracle. So when Jesus turns water into wine, that's not that. So the traditional, and you can find theologians all the way back who say this: God can act in two ways. He can act through secondary causes, through natural causes, or God can act apart from them in a miraculous way. But that's the rare exception. That's a very rare exception to the rule. Normally, and you can find theologians all the way back. Normally, God, into the Middle Ages and earlier, God normally acts through the natural to produce the effects that he wants to produce. So yes, there are miracles, but by the way, miracles were never the way people argued for the existence of God, primarily. When Jesus did miracles, he was not trying to convert atheists. Say, see, I turned water into wine, God exists. The people at the wedding feast of Cana were all devout Jews who believed in God. By and large, all the miracles Jesus performed in the New Testament were performed in the sight of devoutly religious people who believed in God. So miracles do not have the function of converting atheists. Miracles have a salvific function. They're signs, that's what they're called in Scripture. They're signs of God's love and of God's power, and meant to sort of help, so God is showing that he cares for us, but he's also showing he has the power to save us. So but people who focus on, they want to convince, basically looking for miraculous in nature to prove God, that's not the way to go about things. I mean, that's not the traditional way.
Yeah. Someone has a question here. I was listening to Christopher Hitchens, and I learned about Hitchens' razor. Quote, what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. I'm trying to respond to it. Can you offer any help?
Yeah, I think that probably goes back to David Hume, if I'm not mistaken, who put it in a somewhat different form. But there is evidence for God. There's evidence for God, as I say. So if you go to the Catechism talks about, it doesn't talk about proofs, I think. It talks about ways to God. And one comes with the human person. In fact, our spiritual faculties, our reason and free will. Well, there is a case where we can't, where the philosophical argument, this is not just an assertion. There are strong philosophical arguments. They go back as far as Plato and Aristotle, and there are also more modern arguments that human reason and free, that there are aspects of the human person, are rationality and freedom that can't be explained just through physics and chemistry and biology. And we believe that points to the divine author, source of them. That's one, from the human person, and the Catechism also says the other way is from the physical universe. And there, as I said, when you point to the physical universe, it's the existence of the universe and its orderliness. So those are evidence. When atheists say there's no evidence for God, they have in mind a specific kind of evidence. They have in mind the evidence we have for physical things, like this pen or something. How do we have evidence in natural science in two ways. You can have evidence that something exists either because you physically sense it directly, or you can have evidence that something exists even though you can't possibly sense it because it is a natural cause of what you sense. And in my example there, a simple example, is a magnetic field. Human beings cannot sense magnetic fields. Some creatures can, but we can't. The way we know there's a magnetic field is we see its effects. It's the cause of certain effects that we can see. And so we have a compass, and we see the compass needle move. So we know there's a compass and that its needle moves by direct sensation. And we infer that there's a cause of it, which we call a magnetic field. That's evidence for a materialist. God admittedly cannot have evidence of either of those kinds because one, he's not a part of the physical world. He's not a part of nature. So you cannot sense God. And God is not the natural physical cause of things. He's not like a magnetic field. So God is not a cause within the world. That's why they think there's no evidence for him, because he's not a cause within the world. But he is the cause of the world. And that's another way of having evidence. So go back to The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, that novel testifies to its existence of an author who we call Tolkien. Okay? That doesn't mean that Gandalf and the other characters walking around in Middle-earth are going to bump into Tolkien. He's not in the novel. Tolkien is not a part of his creation. He's not in the pages of the book. So Gandalf and all the other characters in the novel are not going to have direct evidence by meeting him. So, but nevertheless, the novel testifies to an author who created it. In the same way, God, even though he's not a part of the world, that we can't run into him unless we lived 2,000 years ago. We can't run into God. You're not going to see him with a telescope. But the fact that there is a universe testifies to an author of the universe. It's a perfectly reasonable inference, like a symphony testifies to the composer. He's not there in the symphony hall. He's not there playing the notes, but you know there was a composer.
Aquinas made a very similar argument. 3 more questions. One person asked, and I'm trying to see, how do you answer Stephen Hawking's assertion and explanation that something from nothing, I don't know if it's possible or impossible, the person mistyped it here, in the grand design?
Yes, well, that's the one I actually, he already answered himself in so he wrote the grand design, or co-authored it with a fellow named Mlodinow, I think in 2010. And in the book, his final book, The Grand Design, Hawking says that that physics can explain how you can have nothing become something. Now, I don't want to get into a long discussion of the quantum gravity ideas. Actually, they're very nice. I actually think that there's a very good possibility, it's a very beautiful idea, that the universe started with what's called a quantum fluctuation. But Hawking at that point was clearly confused, because he gave the definitive answer to that in 1988. And the answer is what I said earlier. And I'll repeat it and give an analogy to make it clearer. What Hawking said in 1988, which really crushes his later argument, is that all that physics ever gives you is a set of rules and equations. That's what physics is. That's what modern physics, since the time of Newton, is all about. It's mathematical rules and equations. The question is, why do those equations? Is there anything real that are described by those equations? Now, let me give you an analogy, which was given to me by my brother. I actually like this analogy a lot. Take a game, chess or baseball. Take your pick. Let's say baseball. I can have a book. The book has all the rules of baseball. The rules of baseball are to baseball games like the laws of physics are to the universe. The rules of baseball tell you what kind of things can happen in a game, in what circumstances they happen, in what order they can happen. They tell you how the baseball game begins. They tell you how the baseball game ends and all that. But one thing the rules of baseball do not tell you is whether there's an actual game of baseball that has ever been played, is being played, or ever will be played. Nor do the rules of baseball have the power to make there be a real, actual baseball game. All the rules say is if you have a baseball game, if you have a game played by these rules, this is how the kinds of things that can happen in it. But it can't make there be a game. And in the same way, thinking of the universe as a big game, of course, it's a very serious game, but think of it as a big game with a set of rules. The laws of physics are those rules, but they have no power to make there be a universe. You could have no universe at all, and that doesn't contradict the laws of physics in the least.
So two more questions. Sorry, go ahead.
So Hawking basically slam dunk defeated that argument. I mean, I don't know whether he forgot it or this was Leonard and Laudenau, his co-author, or what, or he got confused or whatever. But he answered himself. He answered himself 22 years earlier.
So two more questions. One's more specifically science question, which is: do you foresee any new forces being revealed or a theory of everything in the physics?
Oh yeah. Definitely. So this is my area. So one of my specialties, I'm retired for the last 2 years, but one of my main areas of research was called grand unified theories, which are theories which unfortunately still haven't been proven to, or I shouldn't use the word proved, haven't been conclusively, there's not smoking gun evidence for them, but they're theories that unify the three of the four forces of nature. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that one of these, something like that, is probably true. Now, we have a theory called superstring theory, which does some amazing things. And one thing it does, two things it does that no one had ever done before. It unifies gravity with the other forces. Gravity is very hard to unify with the other forces. Superstring theory does it. Secondly, it gives a consistent theory which has both quantum mechanics in it and Einstein's theory of gravity. For many decades, in fact, for 70 years probably, have to think of it. For many decades, physicists could not see how you could put together in a consistent theory, mathematically consistent theory, both Einstein's theory of gravity and quantum mechanics. Superstring theory is the first known way to do that. So many very smart people, top people in my field, think that it's very likely that superstring theory is the ultimate theory of physics. That a superstring theory is the fundamental laws of physics. I think that's probably the case. But on the other hand, it's going to be very hard to ever find clear experimental evidence for that. So we might be in a very funny situation where we have in our hands, at least the ultimate theory of physics, and are not able to find, really strong, conclusive experimental evidence for it.
Yeah, I think that's a good lead into the final question for tonight. Comparing a couple, and that is, do you see God's presence in the aha moments of science during discoveries? And the kind of corollary question to that is, has your Catholic faith made you a better scientist?
I don't think my faith has made me a better scientist. Hopefully, it's made me a slightly better person. I don't. For me, it's not the aha moments in the sense of when I had a good idea. Maybe God gave me some of these ideas. I don't know. It's more when I see. It's very hard when you're in my field of physics and you see the equations and the mathematical laws, not to be struck by how deep the mathematical ideas are. As we've gone further and further in physics, deeper and deeper, I should say, we find more and more sophisticated mathematics, more and more beautiful, more and more rich mathematics there. And that is very striking. I mean, the equations are just, for example, take the principles of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is a very subtle and intricate set of rules and principles. And when you see the intricacy, the subtlety of the laws of physics and how deep they are mathematically, it's very hard not to think that there is some kind of a mind behind it, you know? So that to me is very, as far as in the doing of science, what has affected me is that. I mean, I, of course, was a Catholic before that, but this sort of powerfully reinforced my belief in God. And one of my favorite scriptural verses is, as far as the heavens are above the earth, are my thoughts above your thoughts, and my ways above your ways, says the Lord. And you see how far God's mind is above our mind when you see the laws of the fundamental laws of physics.